Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and manufacturing. Today's episode takes a deeper dive into IDEs, which stands for Integrated Digital Environments. Jonathan and Jen are joined by Steve Nichols, who runs Razorleaf's government business. Steve has been seeing the adoption of IDEs in the government space for some time and shares his perspective on why this is something that is moving beyond government and into commercial manufacturing industries like aerospace, automotive, and industrial equipment. Listen in and learn what is an IDE and what are its components and how it supports a digital thread, and if it's something your organization may want to consider in its digital engineering strategy. Let's tune in to the Razorleaf team.
Welcome back to our podcast, where we are talking about all things related to digital products and manufacturing. And where would we be without acronyms? Today, we're talking about IDEs, and in particular, integrated digital environments, not to be confused with its precursor and close cousin, the integrated development environment. I'd like to welcome my co-host, Jonathan Scott.
Hi, everybody.
And Jonathan, perhaps you could introduce our special guest today.
Absolutely. No, this is a fun topic. Jen, one that I find very interesting, and worked with one of my colleagues who's our special guest today on this topic in the past. So Steve Nichols from Razorleaf Government Solutions, welcome to the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Jen. So I'm Steve Nichols. I look after our government group here at Razorleaf and have quite a bit of experience working with the government, contracts, security, delivery, all kinds of different things there. And I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation today.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And like I said, to start out, I want to reference, Jonathan, you had done a webinar with Peter Bellello from SimData on this same topic, talking about IDEs and in the industry. And you made a couple points in that webinar that I think are worthy of revisiting, because it kind of gives us a good foundation for our conversations today. You talked about how IDEs, which is, like I said, we're talking about integrated digital environments. Probably the first permutation of this was an integrated development environment. So for instance, in software development, where you've got all of the tools necessary to create the software application. When we moved into manufacturing, it became more of a digital environment. And it's really, I loved the analogy that you drew on that, because you talked about it being as if it was a workshop. Particularly easy for me to understand, because my husband actually is in home remodeling and moving into fine carpentry. So he is in the process of setting up his workshop and making sure that he has all of the tools he needs to manufacture the products that he wants. And not just the tools, but all the materials, the layouts appropriate, et cetera. And it's the difference between creating something easily and quickly and repeatable versus slow and clunky and reaching for a tool or running out to get something and slowing your whole process down. So I thought that was a really good place to start.
Yeah, I agree, Jen. I think that I'm not responsible for the analogy there, or even this connection between integrated development environment and integrated digital environment. But the folks who came up with that or transformed that software development concept into something for full digital product development, somebody else gets credit for that. I think I saw the first instance of this maybe back in the 90s or something like that, Steve, and you may have seen something as well for who came up with this idea. But I think it is relevant. I think it is pretty interesting when you are working in this space of digital products and you say, well, how do you optimize it? It's like you just said, you can have a bunch of tools, you can have a bunch of things laying around that you pick up and use, but that's the difference between kind of a hacker and a master craftsman at it. Is, do you have everything laid out the way that you need it to really optimize your process of how you do that work? So I like it. I think it's a great analogy. I can't take responsibility for it, but I think it's a good one.
Well, and from my perspective, and the things that I've been exposed to, I think it represents kind of an evolution in the adoption of digital capabilities into programs themselves. And I think in the 90s and the 2000s, we thought about the end result as the being success of the program. So can we produce an airplane? Can we produce a car? Can we produce those kind of things? And we thought about everything else as being supporting of that end result. And as the tools have gotten better, and the networks and the capabilities have gotten better on the digital side, I think people now start to focus on the program and the process and the tools themselves as being the goal, with the outcome, a successful outcome of that goal being the production of a product. And so you start to have people really focusing on the digital side of the overall effort, then they kick out a product at the end, but we need to optimize the digital side and make sure that works really well. And then if we do all of that correctly, the product comes out on the end, and then we can run it appropriately. And so I think it represents kind of a change in focus on where we actually put our efforts.
Yeah, I want to comment on that, Steve, because I think there's a big driver there that's causing us to focus not just on the end result, right? The thing that you get out of the backside, but the how you get there part. And for me, that has everything to do with speed, right? As I work with some of these customers also, I hear speed and competing with near peers, right? That the US has peers that we compete against and they're faster, and we need to be faster and we need to be more flexible. And that gets you back to the how and the analogy Jen just brought up. You can have a bunch of tools laying around and you might get a house built eventually. But if you want it built quickly, you want to optimize how you do it. You want to have the right tools in your workshop. You want to have all those processes streamlined. That's how you get to faster, and also how you get to more flexible, right? When somebody midstream tells you, "Oh, I want this knob on the furniture over there instead of over here." Well, if you're an expert and you're quick, you can make those changes on the fly. If you don't know how to make adjustments on the fly, it's tough. And I to me, that's what's driving some of that change in the focus on how we do it, not just what we do.
I think the flexibility is a good point, because you're right. It's if you make a change in the middle, as long as you know where you have the tool to make that change, and you know where that tool is, and it's easily accessible, it's already within your workshop, then it's very easy to make that change. So going along the lines of that, or expanding that analogy, can you kind of talk us through some of the components? What does our integrated digital workshop look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jen, because you kind of have to define it more than just what the acronym does for this to make sense, I think, because it's more comprehensive than you might initially imagine, right? So it's easy, as we're talking about tools, to think of, oh, well, an IDE is just a collection of tools. I think it's more than that. I think of it as, I'll say 5 components. This is probably give or take a few. And Steve, please comment here as well, because I think you've got a perspective on this too. But the 5 components I'll say I think we're talking about in an IDE. First is a compute layer of sorts. All kinds of computing power that you might need, and coming from all kinds of places. So it might be as simple as workstations and desktops and laptops and that kind of thing. But it could also be servers and cloud computing and specialized computing power, high performance computing. So you may have lots of different needs in terms of what your environment has to have for computing some of the work that you're going to do. That's a good foundational layer for the second element, which is data. You have to have data that you're going to process. That's why you've got the computing power. But the data takes a bunch of different forms. I'll just mention a couple. I think there's a lot of unstructured data that you might be getting related to, product performance or raw data and information research, things like that are coming into your process of developing a product. And then a bunch of structured data as well. Structured data that you're going to create, that you're going to manipulate, that you'll use from past work. And you've got data that's inside your workshop, and you've also got data outside of your workshop that you might need to incorporate if you're working with partners or suppliers, or, I'm kind of crossing our analogies here, but the data could come from a lot of places. The third element, I think, that you have in an IDE is the tools, right? It's the part that people think of. And I'll combine 2 things here. I'll say it's tools, like software tools, and models, right? And I'm putting those together in a category and being a little loose with it, but saying this is how you process that data. The computing power gives you the engine to do it. The data is what you're processing, but these domain-specific models and tools are how you do that, right? These are CAD engines or MBSE tools or simulation tools, and they might be specific to domains like electrical or mechanical or hydraulics, or and they can be outside of engineering also, right? Don't forget, in a program or a large project, we may have project management tools or financial analysis tools or things like that. But That's the third element. I think the fourth is the processes that connect all of the first three things that I mentioned. So inside of a model or a tool, you'll have some processes, right? Like, how do you run a simulation process, or how do you create a CAD model, that kind of thing. But when you start connecting those and saying, well, how do I get a preliminary design, or how do I do a design review, or how do I release to manufacturing? Those kinds of processes are the things that you are going to have defined in your IDE. So to me, that's the fourth layer, is how do I, use this to get some meaningful result? And then the last one is none of the first four layers are really useful unless you've got them documented and can explain them, right? Because even a master craftsman working into a workshop needs some guidance on, well, what's where, what's here, and what's not. How do I intend to use it? So the person who laid it out does need to describe how they intended for people to use it, including defining what those processes were, what the compute resources are available, what data is there and not there, where you may have to reach out for it, what capabilities you have with the models and tools and which ones maybe you don't have, or how you use them a certain way. So that fifth layer is also important to tying it all together and making the workshop useful to anybody that might walk into it and need to participate. So that's my take on it. But Steve, what would you add, or how would you shape some of that?
Yeah, so I think those are all correct. And I think, if you think about kind of an IDE, I'm going to compare this to a cake real quick, but you think about that as being, those are the ingredients, right? So you throw all those things into a mixing bowl and you mix all those things together, kind of like your flour, your sugar, your eggs, your vanilla. You still have to then kind of figure out the environment. And so you have to bake the thing. And that gets you really your IDE. And so thinking about, Jonathan, what you brought to the table, and then the environment itself, such as your networking, your infrastructure, your requirements, what's driving that. If you have different forms of classification for data, you've got other companies coming into this environment to work too. You bring all those things together with the components that you actually added, which are those baseline ingredients, and then crafting them in a way that then creates that overall integrated digital environment. So it brings those things together in something that is a process, is a capability that then can deliver on that program requirement. So, Jonathan, I think everything you talked about are those base ingredients. You need to keep the overall environment in mind as you bring those together.
Personally speaking, very confused now. Are we baking cakes or are we making furniture? I like that we're being very inclusive on the processes here. So I'm curious. I mean, digital manufacturing has been around for a while. The tools, the processes, et cetera, they've been around for a while. Where did the idea of actually, the name, an integrated digital environment, why do we have to create something to encapsulate this? Where is that coming from? Is there a particular industry driving that? Is there a particular need that it's serving?
I'm going to tell you what I found in my quick research, Jen. I mean, this is by no means definitive, but I was looking around trying to find the first use of IDE to describe integrated digital environment instead of integrated development environment. And the earliest reference I could find was from a gentleman named Steve French back in 2002. And it was a presentation that I found online from the DoD IDE working group. And it was referencing these concepts that we're talking about. Now, in a little bit of a different world, because you can imagine in 2002, it was like, hey, the internet's new, so it was different context, but the concept was there. And that's the first place I've seen it referenced. Now, it gets tricky though, because IDEs obviously relate to lots of concepts we talk about in the digital space. So, is an IDE maybe a workshop for building a digital twin? Some people might say, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Well, then you go look at digital twin and people say, well, the first digital twin was back on the Apollo mission when NASA did, and I'm like, okay. So I don't know if that was the first, but that's where I saw it mentioned first. Steve, I don't know, where do you see it referenced, or have you seen it referenced? What does it go back to?
So we've seen it for a while on the government side. It really comes about when people are thinking about the use of tools and capabilities across an organization and think about, okay, first off, we've got tools. We need many, many groups or many kind of parts of the value chain, such as suppliers, to use these tools. And then you start to think about, okay, how do we get data from one tool into another tool because it'd be useful over in that tool? You start to think about data integration and whether that's a manual process or an automated process. they kind of start to think through, okay, what makes sense? And so it's really starting to see that driver of, Jonathan, as you mentioned earlier, speed to the customer, efficiency, and starting to take advantage of capabilities and tools that just those capabilities didn't exist 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Or people were satisfied with the idea that we could hand jam data from one tool into another, whereas the new set of workers coming in, the new folks coming into programs just don't accept that anymore. They're like, why can't my application, this application, work with that application just naturally? And so the questions are being asked and the assumptions are being brought to the conversation of, why isn't it integrated? Why do we have to move back and forth between tools? That seems so antiquated there. And so starting to think about speed to delivery and workforce capability and general assumptions of what the tools can do, I think really starts to drive the integrated digital environment concept. I think one of the other things we run into is that right now this is really undefined. And Jonathan, you brought up, does it lead with digital twin? Does it lead with some of the other kind of components that we talk through, or some of the other definitions that we bring to the table? I think they all start to lead towards some of this integration that I think we're all striving to have. And it's really based on the perspective of the person utilizing or using the term integrated digital environment with what they are trying to get to as a goal. And so as we start to think about that integration capability or the integration requirements moving forward, I think we're going to start to see those blend quite a bit. But it is really starting to talk to, what does it mean to be unified in an approach? I think there's a couple different drivers there, which I guess we'll get to in this conversation. But I think it's been around for a while. It's just now bubbling up to the surface. But this is the definition of what we're going for that still, I think, needs to be defined.
Yeah. You said a couple of things, Steve, that made me think about the origin of this and the driver for it and that kind of thing. That it's sort of natural that this would evolve in the government space to some degree. When you mentioned integrated and the different folks, the different stakeholders that are involved, right? I've heard from a number of our customers that challenge of the government's often buying a very complex system, whether it's an aircraft or a ship or whatever it might be. Those are some of the most complex products out there. And so you have multiple experts working in multiple areas. And when it's a government type of project, often with multiple companies. And so they've had this concept for years, that an IPT, right? An integrated product team. And those folks, the point of having those IPTs is that you've got lots of areas that you need to bring together to successfully deliver an aircraft, a ship, or whatever. And so to me, IDE, an integrated development environment or an integrated digital environment, it's a logical conclusion to that, which is, well, if I'm going to integrate all of this and have all these people working together and bringing all this data together, wouldn't the environment do it too? Like you mentioned, users who don't accept anymore that, like, well, my data is over here, your data is over there, they can't talk to each other. We have to, right? I think people get tired of maybe getting different answers by asking different people, right? Which is the right answer? How heavy is this thing? Well, if you ask those folks, they say this. If you ask those folks, they say this. What's the answer? Put it all together, integrate all the data, have one digital environment.
Well, and I think it's particularly pertinent in the government space, right? Or aerospace as well, because they're fairly closely related, because it's not just the complexity, right? It's the longevity, right? So, I know that the FAA, for instance, has for a long time required you to have all the product definition and, for instance, a CAD model or whatever, but you have to store that for years and years and years in a form that it can be read years from now, even if applications have changed. So there's, the use of standards, et cetera. And as I understood it, IDE was basically not just the government asking for, yes, please give me the delivery of the airplane. Also tell me how you created all of the things that you used to create that, so that if at some point I need to recreate that and company X, you're not around, company Y, you're not around, materials have changed, et cetera, I have all of that information encapsulated. And that is the product definition. Not just the product, but everything it took to create that. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think that's a big driver here, is that information preservation, that requirements traceability from base all the way through end of life. And it's also control of the information. So at some point in 20 years, if you're going to ask a question back against a program, you don't have to go digging through and finding, whichever company delivered that and had modified it, and then go through information ownership kinds of conversations and kind of trying to figure that out. It all sits in that integrated digital environment, so that you've got that information, you've got the requirements, you've got the program, you got the decisions, how you got from A to B to W to Z, those kind of things.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting point you're raising there by what you two are talking about. The idea that when we went digital and it stopped being deliveries of all this stuff in paper, right? It gets harder to find the right information, right? Because you have so much. The digital information, you can keep so much of it, and you need exactly the right one. What's the latest released one from who's the authoritative source, right? And so to figure that out when you suddenly have this huge volume of data, the best way to do it is if it's all integrated and the right place to look for the authoritative data, instead of accidentally finding some work in process data, some data that was copied, or, but with digital, that's the danger of digital. That information can proliferate. So you need to find the right stuff. And an IDE is a good way to know what's authoritative.
Yeah. And we've talked in the past about the problems with digital hoarders. So
well, and you start to look, it's no longer a question of, do we have the data? We have the data, right? It's, can you get information? Can you generate answers? Can you take actions out of that data? And that becomes the magic, right? And so being able to apply them tools, digital tools, those capabilities to that massive amount of data, which grows every day, it becomes really the point of what you're trying to do, not just gather the data.
So given that we've somewhat established that that the term or the idea or the concept, the driver is came originally from government or defense, and then aerospace and defense. Steve, with all of your work with our government partners, what's been your experience with the IDE?
Overall, the experience, I guess I'd say, is that it has yet to really be defined. That IDE is based on the group that you're chatting with at that time, what their understanding of the IDE is, and really what their goal is. So we throw out IDE overall, and then you really have to say, okay, why are we driving to that? And what does that mean? And it's really understanding kind of the starting points for the conversation, what people are bringing as assumptions to the conversation. And I really think that IDE is an extension of this start of tool capabilities and workforce development. And then they started to go from like a model-based engineering, MBSE, right? So you start with the MBSE type concepts where people can document not just tool capabilities, but processes, and start to pull other folks into the conversation and start to say, okay, how do we take these capabilities, which are tools, how we think about them, and start to bring them together in a way that lends to some more efficiencies. And so thinking about starting that conversation at that model-based engineering, that model-based systems engineering, and then starting to go through and digitize processes, digitize connections, really move them forward, I think starts with that set of capabilities and assumptions that then leads to, well, how do we catalog all of these things together? That becomes your integrated digital environment. But it's really understanding the assumptions that are coming into the conversation to begin with, to know kind of where you're going.
So you see it more as a natural progression, a natural evolution, if you will, from MBE to MBSE to like, okay, now we have all of these things. How do we bring them together?
I do. I see it as a natural evolution of starting to figure out how to bring pieces of conversations together that exist now as digital capabilities, but historically may have been a little more stovepiped, and bringing them together into a more of a common framework and common approach.
Yeah, not to be self-referential, but I'm going to go a little philosophical on us here. I mean, I think what you're saying, Steve, what I'm hearing, and at least how I view it, is that an IDE is a product itself, right? There are goals and requirements you have for that IDE that you need to understand as you build it out, as you define it, as you architect that IDE. And then over time, you build out an IDE. So, I know we're here talking about using IDEs to make digital products, but I think an IDE itself is something that you have to make, and they're unique. And again, that's my viewpoint. I don't know if everybody sees it that way, but that's what I hear, Steve, out of some of what you're describing. Is you got to talk to the customer, understand what kind of IDE they want, what are their goals and requirements for it, and then you can start building it.
Yeah, and we referenced that earlier on in our conversation of the focus is not necessarily fully on the end product when you're thinking about what you're doing here, but your focus starts to shift to the capability that generates that end product. And so that capability being that IDE, what do we bring together as far as the components, ingredients that you talked about earlier? How do we bring those together in a way that IDE generates the product that we're looking for it to generate? And so it's a very deliberate focus on the process that then generates the end product, as opposed to a focus on the product and thinking about how we got there.
Right. To your point, they're linked, right? We're trying to make an aircraft, so we need an IDE that can help us make an aircraft, which tells you something about the requirements for that IDE. Oh, it has to have, aeronautic simulation tools in it, and it needs to have, whatever else that helps you get to an aircraft, because, you're making an IDE for an aircraft. That's different than making an IDE for a door hinge. Those are two different animals.
So just to be clear, there's no band saws, there's no hand planers or anything like that. Okay.
Right. Or frosting or candles, any of that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and thinking about, there's probably overlap there, but a medical device, an IDE that kicks out medical devices are going to have other tools or other capabilities that are plugged into that overall IDE. So you have medical devices, you got aviation, you have automotive, you probably have shipbuilding in there. But let's think about combines. Combines are a pretty complex, set of capabilities all rolled into one, right? It's really a system. And it's a system that can be designed by another system, but then that system itself as a combine has to be upgraded. It has things that go into it, things that age, mechanical kind of changes as it goes. And so you've got that IDE for that combine and that IDE for that aviation asset. They probably have some overlaps, but they probably have some dependencies that are required for what they're actually trying to deliver as an end result. And so kind of making sure that the IDE has those capabilities in it is what you're focused on as far as the IDE that then kicks out a combine or kicks out an aviation asset, as opposed to, well, we're just kicking out this end result.
So that raises a really good question. So we've talked about, starting in aerospace and defense. You mentioned medical devices. You mentioned industrial machinery. Are there specific characteristics of organizations or products that would require or would benefit from an IDE? Is it everybody? Is it, where's the breaking point? How do you know that you need an IDE? And do you?
Yeah, I think it's going to come back to the goal of the organization that's generating the product. I'm struggling to think that someone who makes toothbrushes needs an IDE, because I don't think of a toothbrush as a complex product. But I'm sure that if we were talking with a toothbrush manufacturer, that they would have requirements for the overall programs that they run that have those integration needs. It would just look much different than an aviation program or one of a combine program. I think about something that is very complex, has a lot of contributors to the process, probably has a lot of oversight and government requirements for safety, for application, those kind of things. I kind of feel like those high value, high risk areas really start or would benefit from an IDE to begin with. But I assume that based on the requirements of the company itself, thinking about speed to market, custom components, changes over time, you could probably make the argument for an IDE across many, many industries. But today we're thinking about the highly complex, highly customizable products that really benefit from that IDE.
Complex discrete, like our friends at 𝙈𝙀𝙍𝙍 would say, complex discrete manufacturing.
Yeah, I'm with you, Steve. I think I like the side of what you said, that is everybody needs one. And that's really for me, because I think you can control the complexity of your IDE and how much you have to spend on it and all that kind of thing, by what you need in it, right? So you can right size it for any industry, but I would make the argument, I think everybody needs one. They all look different. Some of them can be quite simple, but if you need digital to make your product, and I would argue everyone should, and if you think there's benefit by taking all of the digital things you might do about that product and integrating them together so they're not all in a bunch of silos, and I would argue everybody should think about product development that way, I think everybody needs one. It's just, I think they vary in what they look like and how challenging they are. And I'll give an example of that across industries as well. Like we mentioned, the complexity of the product is one that easily points to, yeah, you need a pretty evolved IDE that you'll really benefit from that. But I think the complexity of the process of manufacturing could also be that. I know a couple of customers that we know of who make things like consumer goods, like toilet paper, diapers, those things where you say, well, the product is pretty straightforward. It's not that complex. But the process, oh my goodness, right? The level of optimization that goes into that and some of the domains that you don't necessarily think of related to financial modeling and chemistry and other things, it's just not what you think of when you're thinking of complex products like aircraft or ships. But I think an IDE is still a valuable tool for those organizations to get their product delivered. So I like the answer. I like it being even more broad that everybody needs one.
Well, and keep in mind, this comes back to an earlier point in the discussion, right? An IDE is based on the viewpoint of the organization that's actually looking at it, right? And so this is a big aviation organization, an aviation OEM. Their viewpoint and their need is going to be different than a consumer goods organization. They both have benefits that they can derive from an IDE, but those benefits are going to be based on the organization asking the question.
It's interesting, Jonathan. I was going to allude back to one of our other podcasts where we talked about everybody does PLM, whether or not they have a PLM system is another question. So basically what you're saying, what I hear you saying here is that anybody that's manufacturing a product that has digital assets or is creating digital assets has some level of digital environment.
I think that's right.
What's going to differ is the level of complexity, probably how integrated it is.
Exactly. I would say it's the maturity of your IDE, right? How mature is it? How much of what you have is digital? How well integrated is it? Does it cover all of your needs? That kind of thing. But I like that, Jen. I think that's exactly right. Just like everyone does PLM, everyone has an IDE, but how mature is it? How much effort have they put into it? How well do they curate it?
Right. And that will, and the effort required to do all of those things is only going to increase with the complexity of either the product or, to your point, the processes of creating that end user product. So one of the things, Steve, you were saying is as far as like how when you've identified, okay, yes, we have to our point, like everybody has a digital environment. How do you create an official IDE? What are the steps to building an intentional IDE?
So I guess, like I said, we'd have to look at the requirements and what the customer is hoping to get out of their IDE. Why are we actually talking about an IDE? And like you said earlier, Jonathan, you said everybody does PLM. And it's just whether they do it with a traditional PLM system, they do it on spreadsheets, they do it in Teams, whatever that happens to be. I think everybody does integrated environments. It may be that my integration happens to be that I email my spreadsheet over to somebody else, right? So they're doing those types of things. And for some organizations, that may work. There may not be a benefit to investing in other types of integration. So it's really thinking about what's the driver here, what's driving that I component of an IDE. It's starting to think about the capabilities of the tools, the digital tools they're using, and starting to think about not necessarily the processes that an organization has today, but what could the processes be utilizing the capabilities of the tools tomorrow? What benefits does investing in those capabilities and tying things together, what benefit did that deliver, right? Does that deliver a cost benefit? Does that deliver a regulation benefit? Does that deliver a speed to customer benefit, right? Why are those things there? So understanding those requirements. And then for organizations that want to make those investments for whatever reason, want or request or desire, whatever that is, right? If they're it being pushed by their end customer? Is it a market? What is it? Really thinking about, okay, what are the baseline or foundational systems that they actually have today? And can we start to take advantage of the capabilities of those systems and starting to tie some of those systems together, integrate those systems in a way that they don't have today? If they have a PLM, if they have an MES, if they have an ERP system, if they have a CRM system, what are some basics that we can take advantage of today to start to deliver benefits on a rapid basis? I think that because IDE is really perspective based, and you get some folks that come in and think about an IDE as being kind of this utopian end goal of just digital nirvana, right? Digital, that kind of end result has sometimes the potential to be unachievable. It can be very expensive. It might be 5 years in the future. It might be based on roadmaps of other tools that they have that have yet to be realized. And so starting to really think about, okay, that's great, but how do we actually get benefit today? How do we increase the ROI? We turn around, what's our investment that we can actually start to realize? Well, okay, where are we starting? And let's say, okay, here's our end goal, but here's the 4 little foundational pieces that we're going to go achieve this quarter or this half, and actually start to make progress. You can keep the end goal in mind, but unless you start to make some progress and you start to get some stakeholders that see benefit and start to become champions of the process, you're going to overwhelm the organization. You're going to overwhelm the program in a way that you're just not going to be successful. You're not going to make progress. And so it's thinking about where you're going and the foundation pieces you have as kind of seeds of the process to move forward.
I think I would add a couple things to that, Steve, and maybe this is implied in how you described it, but I think as you do all that development and as you sort of progress incrementally what your capabilities are, I think you also have to think about data too. How do you get data added into that mix? If you have data that you need to load into your IDE, it's a little bit like the raw material in your workshop, right? Is I've got all the right tools. Do I have the raw material also? And then I think the icing on the cake that you don't want to forget, again, probably implied in what you were describing, is document as you go. What do I have, right? Because it's great to have it, but it's more important that people can use it, right? And can you bring people into your IDE as you develop it instead of, oh, wait till we're done. When we're done, I'll show you around and you'll be able to use it all. So that documentation piece, I think, is also important. But all the steps you described make perfect sense. That first step of requirements is so critical because otherwise, what are you building and why?
Well, and I like the baseline as well. Like these are the tools that we have right now, because I think a big piece of, it's actually even in the term, right? IDE. It's everybody has a digital environment. It's how integrated is it? To your point, how does data flow throughout the environment? And I'm interested in both you guys' input on how important is integration to this process? Like, what are the benefits? It seems to me like that would be a driving factor to speed, to repeatability, traceability, et cetera, is that the integration between the various pieces.
I think that's right. I think that the objective about speed, about how this optimizes processes and makes people more flexible, able to work faster, all of that comes from that integration of data. And integration of data implies an alignment, an ability for pieces of data to work together or to use them across different domains, different perspectives. And without that, the opposite is having a lot of friction in your process, right? I'm starting on something and then I have to stop because I don't have the information I need. I don't have the data, or it doesn't match up with somebody else's view of that data. All that friction is slowing things down and gumming up the works. So, what you're going after is speed. And I think you have to integrate the data, and implied in that is align it in some ways, understand it, define it, have a common language about it. There are a lot of things you need to do to get to having integrated data, but I think it is critical to the process.
Well, and I also, Jen, you asked about data, and I think that's really important. I was thinking, I took a step back and, we're talking about integrated digital environments. To me, it really comes down to also an organizational digital environment and changing or potentially embracing the new capabilities that you have, and not necessarily thinking about digitizing the processes that you have today, but what can you do in the future? So what questions do you want to think about, or do you want to be able to answer that today take, weeks or months to answer, if at all possible? What could you do with that? And so this, not only does this drive a digital change, but it drives an organizational change. And so breaking free of how you used to do something sometimes is a really hard concept, because what you're doing isn't that it doesn't work. It works for you today. But if you start to go through thinking about how could we be working? How could we knock out a whole series of processes here, because now the tools are just naturally delivering that end result, or that end result now ties into a dashboard somewhere else, that then you have that kind of cohesive view of something, whereas that piece of data used to be a goal in of itself, and now that piece of data is a natural output, which allows you to answer different questions or questions more quickly. The digital and the organizational really start to change here, and thinking about and being open to that organizational change is just as important.
It's a little bit hard to hold these two thoughts in your head at the same time, but you noted it, Steve, which is you may be transforming a process. You may be taking a process that you do today that it's simple, it works, but it's time consuming or whatever. And when you think about what you need for tomorrow, it's completely different using digital tools. It's a totally different animal, and you think about it totally differently. So you're going to really transform how you do that thing. But you might be just incrementally improving or maturing your IDE, right? So over time, you can take your IDE and incrementally improve it and change things and make them better and that sort of thing, even if one of those incremental improvements of the overall IDE is complete transformation of a process. We're doing it digitally instead of, in an integrated way, instead of doing it in some disconnected way with other systems. So you can hold both those thoughts in your head at the same time and say, yeah, we can move along and improve this and mature it over time. But some of those steps, don't forget, they may be a big deal to the people involved in them and the way the process behaves. It could, be a big change that people need to get used to.
So we've established that integration, and not that we needed to establish it. Again, it's in the term, plays an important role within the IDE. I think there are different types of integration that we need to talk about. And I'm interested in both you guys' input on what are different types of integration that you see. Is it just data? Is it processes? Can you dig a little bit deeper in those?
You're touching on some really critical ones, Jen, and I think that's right. It's easy to say, oh yeah, we have to integrate it, right? All the digital, all the things. But there are a bunch of kinds of integration to think about that you want to have in mind when you're thinking about building an IDE and what your requirements might be for one, right? So there's data integration. So how are you going to get all that data in the environment? And I mentioned earlier when we were talking about kind of the 5 elements, different kinds of data, unstructured, structured, external, internal. So you need to think about how do you get the data, bring it in, deal with it, manage it, connect it, even define it, right? So that's one kind of integration, data population, data integration. And then there's, what about managing the data itself, right? So you've got lots of different domains and tools. How do you manage it, not just populate it or load it? I think of things like PDM tools, PLM tools, ALM tools. What are the things that you need in an IDE, and how does it deal with mechanical data, electrical data, code, those kinds of things? And then there's the kind of integration across the systems you might put together in an IDE. So it's a little bit like, I just described with managing data, managing models and tools. But when you think about those systems like PLM and ALM and MES and ERP and any other systems you might have, how do those connect? What kind of integration do you need there? And there's more than that, right? But those are just a couple when you start thinking about what are the patterns of integration you need in an IDE.
The interesting part of that, and the part that I've always loved, is it's not, as an industry, as I've watched the manufacturing industry grow over the last 25 plus years, let's just say, is we went very much from we used to transfer all of the data, and basically an integration was like pushing over all of the data. And what I think we're realizing is it's not that. It's what data do you need from that system? What data do you need to pull? Not all of it. I don't need, for instance, in just a simple CAD translation, I don't need the entire part. I need where it mates. That's it. And you can get a lot better fidelity and speed, et cetera, with just focusing on what you need for the integration versus pulling all the data.
That's where that process piece comes in, right? If you understand the requirements, what are you trying to achieve, and what's the process you can use in the future to get there, then you start to understand, what do I need to integrate? What data is required, and what's just noise?
Steve, what are you seeing as far as different types of integration? Would it echo what Jonathan and I are talking about here?
Yeah, I think it does. And I also keep in mind that for some of the programs that we have, you talked about what data gets integrated, really what data gets transferred. And if all data is equal, then you have to make that selection. What I was thinking about was some government programs that are sensitive in nature. And so data at one level of sensitivity may not be appropriate at one of the other levels of sensitivity, but yet may be required. Some representation of that data at a different level of sensitivity may still be appropriate. And so thinking about that, goes back to that process. What actually gets transferred and for what purpose? And then, is it appropriate in that other environment, right? So the integration may strip out some pieces of information as something else moves through, some metadata or some representation of the data moves through, and then gets represented at a different level of sensitivity.
I love it, Steve. I love the idea that segregation is actually part of data integration.
It is, right? But that drives for success of program.
Right. It's definitely a specific requirement when we're talking about like what kind of data do you need to transfer to achieve your goals. It's also what kind of data are you allowed to transfer and to whom?
Because it's not just defense, right? It's not just sensitive data in the concept that Steve, you just described, but it's intellectual property, right? We think about supply chains, big supply chains where people are working together and they have some form of IDE where they all have to share a common CAD platform or whatnot. But even in those supply chains, people think about, like you described a minute ago, Jen, how do I share the interfaces, the mating surfaces of a CAD model rather than the internal geometry? Because that's my IP. So I just want to integrate what's necessary to do the job, nothing more, nothing less.
Well, and keep in mind when we're talking about integration, it may not be model that's intellectually sensitive. It may be cost. It may be requirement. It may be, right? So it goes back to that, what actually needs to be exposed to the viewer from the perspective of the integrated digital environment. And yet, what are we actually trying to control?
We could go on about this for hours.
We could, but we sadly are about out of time. Matter of fact, we're probably, for our recording schedule, a little bit over time. So I'm going to need to wrap it up here. I think that some of the finer points that we've covered here is that, like PLM, everybody has a digital environment, or most manufacturers have a digital environment. How integrated it is or not, how formal it is or not, will depend highly on specific needs, product, process, complexity, security, etc. But it is very specific. There is no one size fits all IDE. It's based on your specific needs.
And you might have multiple, right? That's another important point. You might not just have one. You might have several in your business or your organization. They might change over time. You might connect them or not connect them. All kinds of things there.
Right. You're exactly right. Before we say goodbye, Steve, do you have any parting words of advice to our listeners as far as IDEs in general, or where to go to learn more? Anything at all?
Yeah, just say from an IDE, just general approach. Start with a perspective in mind, or start with a goal in mind, and then think about where you're starting. And don't try to take it all at once. Think about what you have, the capabilities you have today, and can you get some near-term wins and some near-term benefits by just expanding or growing those in-house capabilities and get a couple champions. And then I guess finally, think about your overall process and bring in somebody who has an outside bring in an outside perspective to the conversation, not somebody who's married to what you're doing today, to give you kind of that neutral party view of what can change and what the benefits of those changes can be to really help kind of broaden the conversation that you and your team are having.
Good advice. And to your point, how to measure those changes so that you can continually basically build on the successes, demonstrate and build on the successes. So thank you, Steve. Very, very good advice. Thank you very much for joining us today. I want to remind all of our listeners that this is a conversation. It's intended to be a conversation. If there is anything you have on this particular podcast, any questions you have about it, please reach out and ask us the questions. If there's topics that we haven't covered yet that you'd like to see us cover, we'd love to hear those suggestions too. And until next time, stay sharp.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening in to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. We appreciate you. If you have any questions or comments for our podcast team, or have an idea for a new topic for our team to cover in 2024, please send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We would love to hear from you. Until next time, stay sharp.